Yeah, good evening, sir. Good evening, madam, and good evening, dear students.
Kamachi.
On behalf of RAISA, today we have our academic session on theory questions discussion. Today we have 4 questions, and to start with, I will invite Dr. Sai Dikshit to present the question on anatomy of larynx, applied anatomy of nasopharynx and nasocavity and larynx. Dr. Sai Dikshit. Dr. Sai. In the meantime, if Dr. Sai is taking time to join, can we proceed with the fourth speaker, madam, Dr. Monica?
No. If sir is doing something, doesn't matter because I'm not going anywhere. So no problem.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dr. Monica is logged in already.
Whoever is there can start presenting.
Dr. Hanna Monica?
No, Sai Dikshit, I am seeing his video, Kamachi.
Good evening, sir. Sorry, I'm here, sir.
Oh, no, okay. Sai Dikshit also I am seeing the video, but audio is not heard.
Yeah,
yeah, I think now
so we'll start with oxygen. Yeah. Dr. Sai?
Sir, good evening, sir.
Good evening. Go ahead, Sai Dikshit.
Sir, can you able to hear now, sir?
Yeah, we are able to hear you now.
Okay, sir. Sir,
we'll proceed with Dr. Sai Dikshit first presentation.
Okay. Yes.
Sir, my question today is clinical anatomy of nasopharynx and clinical anatomy of larynx, and how would you anesthetize a 40-year-old man for awake nasotracheal intubation?
Yes.
First, clinical anatomy of nasopharynx, sir. Nasal cavity, sir. Clinical anatomy of nasal cavity. Question is, initially we have to know that what is nasal cavity, sir. When we are inspiring air, there will be humidification by the high water content and warmed by high rich plexus of the capillaries, sir. And ciliated mucosal cells remove contaminated mucus, sir. And terminates increases mucosal area 166 centimeter square area for humidification and enhance air turbulence and help filter air, sir. During exhalation,
voice is breaking. Voice is breaking.
So during exhalation, reclaims heat and moisture, sir. Minimize heat and moisture loss. In endotracheal intubation, it bypasses nose so as to maintain.
Dr. Sai, your audio system is not good. Your audio is not good.
Now it is getting a little bit clearer.
Dr. Sai?
You come close and talk. I think that is the problem.
Okay.
Yeah, it's better now. You continue.
Okay, sir. During expiration, during exhalation, reclaims heat and moisture and minimize heat and moisture loss. During endotracheal intubation, they will be bypassing nose, so there will be no humidity and moisture of the inspired air. So, humidifiers are used here, sir. And in normal room temperature, there will be no humidification of the room inhaled room air, sir. So, should be warm to body temperature and saturated with the water vapor. In tracheal intubation with high fresh gas flow, bypasses this humidification system, exposing this lower airways to dry room temperature gases. By prolonging exposure of these dry room temperature gases leads to dehydration of the mucus, altered ciliary function, insufficiency of the secretions, atelectasis, and ventilation perfusion mismatch. Atelectasis and VQ mismatch is the most commonly particularly seen in underlying lung diseases. Able to hear nothing?
Yeah, it is clear in bits and pieces, not continuously. Suddenly it becomes clear, suddenly it becomes broken.
Sir, I'm not able to follow at all, sir, actually. I don't know.
He is talking about humidification function of the nose. That's what I can comprehend from what he has talked all now. Try, Sai, let us see how it goes. Try to talk and continue.
There is the clinical anatomy of the larynx, sir.
Ah,
The larynx, their day-to-day life, sir. So we have to know some points regarding this larynx, what we have clinical anatomy, sir. Subglottic stenosis, congenital malformation of the thickened cartilage results in severe narrowing of this subglottic airway and results in respiratory obstruction. Other regions which causes subglottic stenosis are trauma and scarring after prolonged endotracheal tube intubation. It is mostly seen in premature babies and in ICU patients. Other clinical anatomy of larynx is laryngoscele. It is a mucus-filled cavity seen in obstruction of the ventricular arteries by inflammation and by scarring and by tumor. It may expand into regions that leads to internal laryngoscele and external laryngoscele. Internal laryngoscele is
போய் பாஸ்வேர்ட் கேக்குது பாஸ்வேர்டு இங்க இமெயில் அனுப்பிச்சு
laryngoscele. When this laryngoscele is expanded into the paraglottic space and epiglottic space. Can you able to hear myself?
உன்னோட
yeah,
லேப்டாப்
not very clearly. So a lot of interruptions are also there. Somebody else also is talking. Not all the other people's mics are not muted properly. Can hear some other conversation also.
Sorry for the interruption, sir. If possible, I'll request Sai to log in again with his mobile phone. That will be better. His audio system is very poor. In the
Yes.
meantime, I'll request Dr. Hanna Monica to start with oxygen, sir.
Okay. Right.
Okay.
If she has a very clear audio system, she can go ahead.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I request Dr. Anna Monica to start her presentation on oxygen delivery, oxygen transport, oxygen flux, and oxygen toxicity.
Good
Anna
evening,
Monica
sir.
from Raja Medical College.
Am I audible, sir?
Yeah. Good evening, sir and madam.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, ma'am. I'm Hannah Monica.
Thank you, sir.
Balaji Medical College.
Hmm.
Now I'll share the screen.
Good. First time I'm seeing somebody preparing PPT for that. Good.
No,
Yeah. I appreciate that. Good.
thank you, sir. I'll start the topic, sir. My topic is enumerate vocal cord fallacies with diagrams, and the second one is evaluation and management of difficult airway.
Wait. Kamaji said oxygen transport. That's somebody else's talk?
Yes, sir. That's fourth person topic, sir.
Okay. Now you are second person. So there's a
Yes, sir,
confusion
I'm
again. You are talking on a different topic. Right.
Yes, sir.
Right. Evaluation and management of difficult airway and
Sorry, sir. It's a mistake from my side. Sorry, sir. Sorry for the confusion. Sorry, sir.
yeah. So the first half of the question is evaluation and management of difficult airway. I thought Vasanthi madam would have taken that topic because she loves that
No
topic.
problem, sir. No problem, sir. We both of us will do it. I'll do this.
Yes, sir. I'll start with the evaluation and management of difficult airway, sir.
Okay.
Difficult airway, the definition goes like the clinical situation in which conventionally trained anesthesiologist experiences difficulty with face mask ventilation of the upper airway or difficulty with tracheal intubation or both. So this depends mainly on patient factors, clinical setting, skills and preferences of a practitioner. So the definition includes various types of difficulties like difficult mask ventilation, difficult supraglottic airway ventilation, difficult laryngoscopy, difficult video laryngoscopy, intubation, failed intubation, and difficult placement of supraglottic airway. Can't intubate, can't oxygenate. This is CICO, which is very rare. And difficult fiber optic intubation, difficult surgical airway, and complications at the time of extubation. So I'll be telling the definitions of three. Difficult mask ventilation definition is when unassisted anesthetist not able to maintain greater than 90% saturation with 100% O2 and positive pressure mask ventilation, and where the patient's previous saturation was 90% before. Or the other definition is not possible to prevent signs or reverse signs of inadequate ventilation during positive pressure mask ventilation. The mask ventilation scale will be like, first one is ventilation by mask, Second one, either using airway or adjuvant with or without muscle relaxant. The third one is difficult ventilation, which means inadequate, unstable, or requires two providers with or without muscle relaxant here also. And the fourth one is unable to mask ventilate with or without muscle relaxant. The definition of difficult laryngoscopy comes like unable to visualize any portion of vocal cords after multiple attempts of conventional laryngoscopy. As we know, it's CL grade 4. And the definition of difficult tracheal intubation is proper insertion of endotracheal tube requires if greater than or equal 3 attempts or greater than equal to 10 minutes. The difficult airway which causes anesthesia morbidity can be due to various reasons, which goes like dental damage or airway trauma or pulmonary aspiration or unanticipated surgical airway, cardiac arrest, anoxic brain injury or death. And then now we'll discuss about evaluation. This goes like functional airway assessment, in which ability to visual larynx and intubate depends on alignment of one's eye to larynx. So there the major part is by sniffing position, that is 90 degrees to 125 degrees improvement by atlanto-occipital extension. Like you can see in the diagram, first in supine position, normal lying down patient, oral pharyngeal axis do not overlap. But when extension at atlanto-occipital joint, like you see in the, I'm so sorry, the picture is not clear. Due to extension, oral and pharyngeal axis maximally overlap. This increases mouth opening and optimal alignment with larynx. And other than sniffing position, the rest will be done by this displacement of tongue by size of tongue, which depends on factors like size of tongue, mandibular space, and Mallampati. And now comes to tests and indices of difficult airway. This we have to look into issues like first, history of prior difficulties based on previous records. Second one, physical examination. Third one, special studies like endoscopy, radiological, and advanced studies. First, difficult mask ventilation, we can divide like individual and group indices. Like you all know, it is obese, beard, obese patients, no teeth, elderly, snorers. Beard will be like mask ventilation, like seal won't be proper, and obese patients, reduced FRC will be there, and fall of tongue can happen, and fat tissue in the oropharynx. Because of that, when like it is given differently in different books, BMI greater than 30, I've written here, and then elders age greater than 55. For them, pharyngeal and laryngeal reserve will be less, and the snorers also, which can cause obstructive sleep apnea. In group indices, we can remember like bones and moans. In moans, it is receding mandible and syndromes with facial abnormalities or burn strictures. Then coming to difficult laryngoscopy or tracheal intubation, it comes like classes. First one, we can discuss about atlanto-occipital joint. There, directly Delicken's test. In this, if you keep index finger on the mandible and the other hand index on the atlanto-occipital joint, if you ask the patient sitting position, look up the ceiling without raising the eyebrows. If the height is increasing, the patient is fine. If it's not increasing, there's a reduced view. And indirect test, it's palm print sign and prayer sign. Prayer sign and palm print sign we can see in diabetic. Prayer sign, if you ask patient to fold the hands, if there's gap between the two hands, it is prayer sign positive. In palm printing sign, there are 4 grades. If you can see only fingertips on the page, it is like difficulty is there. Then second comes temporomandibular joint. First one is basically 2 movements are there in temporomandibular joint. First one is rotation of the condyle, and the second one is forward movement of mandible. So we can test this by 2 tests. First one is 3 finger, admitting 3 fingers into the mouth, and the second one is if the good sliding of function of mandible is there or not. That we can see by keeping the thumb on tragus and the index finger on mastoid. if we ask the patient to open, like move the mouth forward, the thumb rests in the socket of the joint and the index finger will go forward with the mandible. Then it's like a good sliding function of mandible is present. And then Calder test. This we ask the patient to protrude the mandible. If the mandible is anterior, it's normal. But if the mandible is inline or posterior, then it infers that the reduced view is there. The third one is mandibular space. Here we can see about thyromental distance. The test is called Partil's test. It comes from tip of mentum to thyroid notch. If it's like normal is greater than 6.5, if less than 6 centimeter, this infers difficult intubation. Then hyomental distance. This is from hyoid to the tip of mentum. If the distance is less than 4 centimeter or 2 finger breadth, then it infers difficulty. Then interincisor distance. This, if it's greater than 3 centimeters, it's normal. Then upper lip bite test. This is like assessed by, we ask the patient to touch the upper incisor, touch the vermilion line with lower incisors. If it is touching, it's grade 1. If it's touching just the upper incisor but not vermilion line, this is grade 2. If it's not touching upper incisor, this is grade 3. Grade 3 infers difficult intubation. And then the fourth one is oropharynx. Like everyone knows, this is Mallampati classification. We have to make sure 3 conditions. The patient should be sitting up, tongue should be out, and no phonation. So first grade is, I'm sorry, I drew the diagrams down. First one is uvula, fascial pillars, soft palate, hard palate, all are visible. The second grade, fascial pillars and soft palate are visible. Third grade, soft palate and hard palate are only visible. Fourth grade, only hard palate is visible. Then comes glottic view. This is first given by Conway-Lehane scoring system. In this 4 grades are there, 1, 2, 3, 4. Full glottic view, partial view of glottis, epiglottis, only epiglottis can be seen, and 4th grade, no epiglottis can be seen. This is modified modified 2 times. Modified CL grading includes 2A and 2B, where 2A is partial view of glottis and 2B is arytenoids or posterior part of vocal cords are just visible. Later, again, Cook modification was given, where the 3rd grade is also classified like 3A and 3B, where 3A is only epiglottis seen, which is liftable. 3B, epiglottis can't be liftable. It is adherent. That's all. So here we can infer like 1st and 2A infer easy intubation. 2B and 3A infers with Buji we can intubate. 3B and 4 is difficult intubation. Then comes groups in group indices. Here Wilson's score is there. This includes weight of patient, head and neck movement, jaw movement. Jaw movement is like I said before, interincisor gap, sliding mandible, receding mandible, and buck teeth. And Benumov's 11 parameters are there, which includes like mouth. They have included 2, mandible 2 are there, teeth 4 are there, and neck 3 are there. Then in Lemon law, like to remember just external appearance, look, examine. Examine includes 3-3-2 rule. Like I said, 3 fingers into the oropharynx, that is admitting 3 fingers. 3 rule between hyomental distance, and 2 is with top of thyroid and mandible. Then MPC, M is MPC, 4 is obstruction, and 5th is neck mobility. Difficult airway cart, if we have to make it ready, this should be including the following things: rigid bronchoscope blades, rigid fiber optic laryngoscope, video laryngoscope, tracheal tubes of assorted sizes, tracheal tube guides like Gillette, Buji, etc., and supraglottic airway devices, and then emergency invasive airway access and external EtCO2 detector. Then, according to 2015 guidelines by Difficult Airway Society, difficult intubation guidelines are given. In this, first, management of unanticipated difficult tracheal intubation in adults. I'm discussing about this. The first plan is face mask ventilation and tracheal intubation. If it's successful, confirm tracheal intubation with capnography. If it fails, we are supposed to maintain oxygenation and try SAD insertion or any other options like second generation device, change device or size, maximum 3 attempts, and oxygenate and ventilate. If it's successful, fine. If it's not successful, then we declare as SAD ventilation, failed supraglottic airway devices ventilation. Consider face mask ventilation. If face mask ventilation is also not possible, paralyze and final attempt at face mask is given by using 2% technique and urgence. If it's successful, wake the patient up. If it's not successful, declare CICO, can't intubate, can't ventilate, oxygenate. Then emergency front of neck access, that is scalpel cricothyroidotomy. Post-op care and follow-up. Like as anesthesiologists, we have to make sure that this is documented properly. Formulate immediate airway management plan, monitor for complications, complete airway alert form, explain to patient in person and in writing, and send written report to local database. Then next comes failed intubation, failed oxygenation, the paralyzed anesthetized patient. This explains the before thing. Continue 100% oxygen, declare CICO and plan for emergency front of neck access. In this, scalpel cricothyroidotomy is given, but we can do needle cricothyroidotomy or scalpel cricothyroidotomy. But if we do needle cricothyroidotomy, there we are we need to have jet ventilation. Otherwise, it won't serve the purpose. If it's scalpel cricothyroidotomy, there are two procedures. Palpable membrane, that is by using index, thumb and middle finger should be, we need to palpate and see the index finger for the cricothyroid membrane. Then there, give a transverse stab incision, turn blade through 90 degrees, slide bougie along the trachea and railroad cuffed endotracheal tube, ventilate, inflate and confirm position, secure the tube. If it's impalpable, 8 to 10 centimeter incision we are supposed to give in the direction of chorda to cephalad. Then blunt dissection of fingers to separate the tissues and follow the same sequence like palpable membrane. Then comes extubation guidelines. Here, plan, assess airway and general risk factors. If patient is at low risk, we can try for deep extubation or awake extubation. If deep extubation we are considering, it is an advanced technique and vigilance and trained anesthesiologist is needed. Then recovery and follow-up. If the patient is at risk, first we have to consider, is it safe to remove the tube or not? If yes, we can try for awake extubation and advanced techniques like LMA technique, remifentanil technique and airway exchange catheter technique. Airway exchange catheter technique is like advanced one, and we can put LMA through it and later remove or re-intubate everything. It can be used. And if it's not safe to remove the tube, we can postpone or either do tracheostomy. Then shift to compulsorily we have to shift to high dependency unit or ICU. Then awake extubation, we are supposed to consider these factors: pre-oxygenate with 100% oxygen, suction as appropriate, insert a bite block, position the patient properly, antagonize with proper neuromuscular blockade, establish regular breathing, adequate spontaneous ventilation, minimize head and neck movements, wait until patient is fully awake, like eye opening should be present, obeys commands, and then give positive pressure, deflate the cuff, remove the tube, immediately give 100% O2, check airway patency and adequacy of breathing, continue oxygen supplementation. In obese patients, positioning is very important, ramping and help positioning, rapid airway management positioner, and pre-oxygenated head up and help position, that is head elevated laryngoscopy position. Then I'll talk about enumerate vocal cord palsy.
Wait. This is only one half of the question. Okay. We'll first finish the discussion on this and then you can go to the second half. Okay. Because this itself is a huge topic. And So the question in this is evaluation and management of difficult airway. Correct, isn't it?
Sir,
So
yes,
the
sir.
first half of answer is only evaluation. How do you evaluate? So when you want to evaluate, the very first thing that everybody should be able to write is whether the airway is manageable or not manageable, whether it is going to be an anticipated difficulty or an unanticipated difficulty. That is the first thing that you should mention there. And if it is going to be a very obviously anticipated difficult airway, like in case of say very severe contracture neck or a gross trauma with all the face shattered, you won't risk doing the conventional attempt to secure the airway, isn't it? So there you will be planning for a different technique at the very beginning of the level. Majority of the time you get into problem only when you think that you can manage in a conventional way and then go and induce the patient, paralyze the patient, and then you land up with either not able to ventilate or not able to intubate. That is the situation that happens. So this is called the unanticipated difficult airway. So the first distinction that you should make in a difficult airway is whether it is anticipated or unanticipated. And then the evaluation starts with the history, whether patient has had any previous history of surgery, whether any records or any notes is available, or patient himself is able to recall and tell that he was told that he was a difficult case and somehow they managed to complete the surgery, or a medical alert bracelet is given to the patient saying that previously he had a tough time to intubate this patient. So that history is very, very important. That itself will give you a lot of clue what you have to do. And what was the, even in patients who had a successful surgery without any problem earlier, if they come for a general anesthesia requiring intubation, after several years, there could be a lot of changes anatomically in the same patient. So a positive history of a easy intubation earlier, you should not relax and think that it is going to be easy now also. They could have put on weight, they could have had some rheumatoid arthritis problem after that previous history. So a definite history of difficult intubation earlier will caution you, but at the same time, you must mention in your answer that earlier easy intubation should not be taken for granted that this time also it will be easy. So a thorough evaluation and examination of the patient is important. So after the history comes all the examination, physical examination of the patient. In that first four things that you should mention is the neck movement. How my patient's head can be manipulated, where you mentioned about aligning the axis. Why you want to align these three axes? You mentioned only two axes, mouth and the pharynx, but there is a third axis also, larynx. You didn't mention that in your picture, isn't it? So all the three has to be aligned. You cannot bring them in the same line, but they have to come parallel to each other, because during your Macintosh laryngoscopy, your eye is seeing that. So the eye vision is always in a straight line. So all the axes, if they come parallel to each other, then only you will be able to visualize the glottis. And you mentioned about video laryngoscopy after the definition. A conventionally trained anesthetist, which institution you are coming from?
Balaji Medical.
Balaji, are you using video laryngoscopy every day in your practice?
No.
Then that is not the conventional training, isn't it? So the mentioning video laryngoscopy in the conventionally trained anesthetist is not still included. Maybe in future it will come as part of the training, because video laryngoscope may become or replace the Macintosh laryngoscope, and every trainee will be having a chance to use that, and it may become a routine practice also in future, I don't know. But at present, as per the textbook descriptions, a conventionally trained student or a practitioner gets trained only with a Macintosh or a Miller blade laryngoscope. Okay, so in that situation, you have to have this position, and you must mention the word sniffing position. Okay, that sniffing the morning air. Do you know who described that sniffing position? who was the person who described the sniffing position or called it or gave the name sniffing position to this adjustment of the flexion of the neck and extension of the atlanto-occipital joint?
McGill.
Sir Ivan McGill, correct. He is the person who described this, and so the description should come as flexion at the cervical spine and extension at the atlanto-occipital joint to align the axis of the oral cavity, pharynx, and larynx. Okay, so that is what you have to write there, and you can avoid a lot of other descriptions there, like video laryngoscope. So if it is going to be unanticipated difficulty, the first thing is, evaluation comes with the examination of the neck movement, then mouth opening, then the teeth, then the tongue. These are the four structures you are going to examine. Okay, and by doing this, we will be having a fairly good idea whether it is going to be easy to insert the laryngoscope and then visualize the glottis and introduce the endotracheal tube into the trachea. That is what you have to write. Then once you have done that, then suddenly from after describing about the various methods like Malambetti and the difficult mask ventilation conditions and other things, you have suddenly come to the difficult airway cart. Okay, so you stop the answer saying that these are all the points that you have to see in evaluation, and then start the management. When it comes to management, the first thing you have to write is the difficult airway algorithm. What is your plan? Plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D. That is what you have to write first. And then go on to describe each and everything. What are the difficulties you may face in mask ventilation and how you overcome that? What are the second step plan if you are not able to do the conventional mask ventilation followed by laryngoscopy followed by intubation? This is plan A always. If that is not possible, then you go to plan B where you insert a supraglottic airway device. Then if that also is not possible, then you go for repeat of mask ventilation as plan C. And if that also is not possible and you land up with CICV, then you go for the plan front of neck axis, plan D. Okay, like that first you write the algorithm and then you start describing each and every one. What are the adjustments that you will do? So if you write like that, the answer will be complete and that will be, and you will save a lot of time also, and at the same time present all the important points. Okay, right.
Sir, can I just add something, sir?
Yeah. I was about to ask you what is your.
Sorry, sir.
Hmm.
In the obesity, I think neck circumference is absolutely important. If you don't mention that, it's not correct. So please mention the neck circumference when you talk about obesity. Very, very important. And another important point is, the assessment is more than one particular way of assessment. It is not just, you can't just do Malambetti, you can't just do distances. You can't do like that. You need to have all of them together. Like sir said in the beginning, all of them need to put together. The neck movement, the mouth cavity, the teeth, and the tongue, everything. So you have to mention all of them and say there is not a single assessment. You can't say Malambetti. 90% of the time, if I look at the case sheets of any of the postgraduates who have written, it's always says Malambetti grade 2. It doesn't mention about anything else. We really cannot assess just the Malambetti and make sure that you'll be able to intubate. Malambetti may be very good, maybe even 0-1, but but there's no neck movement, you cannot intubate. So you need to look at more than one factor for intubation. That is a very important thing that you need to remember. And when you talk about airway assessment, though we are having a topic today on anatomy of the nose and things like that, it is worthwhile mentioning that the nasal cavity must also be examined for feasibility of nasal intubation if required. So that also needs to be pushed. That's all. Otherwise, everything else was covered.
Okay, now you can
Okay,
go.
sir?
Yeah, that's another thing. And
Three
and,
actions.
one more thing in your beginning itself, you have to say that you must be checking your equipments and keep it ready. Whenever whether you anticipate difficulty or unanticipated difficulty, you must always check the equipment, and in that you must mention about the cricothyroidotomy kit. That is a very life-saving equipment that should be kept in that, and that should be always be ready in your anesthetic armamentarium, so that you do not know which case you will end up with trouble. Even though the statistics say 1 in 2,850 cases, there may be a difficulty. And every anesthetist lands up with a difficult intubation once in a year, at least. If he's a busy practitioner, at least once in a year, every anesthetist will land up with a difficult intubation case. That is what the statistics say. Okay, so it is always better to have a routine practice of checking the difficult airway cart, including the cricothyroidectomy kit. And if you anticipate difficulty, my advice will be to mark the cricothyroid membrane in the extended position before inducing anesthesia. After doing what is called the Levitan's laryngeal handshake, where you start palpating the hyoid, thyroid, and cricoid, mark the cricothyroid membrane location so that in case of emergency, when you are in a little bit stressed and you are a little nervous, you won't have time to locate that properly. So if you have marked it already, that will be an easy one. You can take a knife and stab in that and immediately access the airway and save a life. Okay, so that will be a better practice than that also can be mentioned in your answer, the management. Okay, right. Now you can go.
Sir, can I add 2 points, sir?
Yeah, please.
For the unanticipated sudden airway issues, there is one thing called ultrasound guided procedures. So it is always better to mention that when you are anticipated airway difficulty, ultrasound can be utilized, and you can just say a few words about the usage of ultrasound in an anticipated difficulty. And regarding the unanticipated difficulty, recently we received one I'll share my screen, sir.
Yeah.
We received the 2022 American Society of Anesthesiologists Practice Guidelines for Management of the Difficult Airway, and it beautifully narrates all the preparations and all the guidelines updated, but it's set to be published, I believe. So before publication, we have received this leak, and it is available, and I've circulated it in our WhatsApp groups also for the benefit of the students. If possible, before going to exams, just go through these guidelines, and it gives, in a nutshell, all the details required for anticipated difficulty airway management as well as unanticipated difficulty airway management. Thank you, sir. I'll stop sharing.
Yeah. Yes, Anna, you can go to the second half of the question.
Thank you, sir. Next comes vocal cord palsies. In vocal cord, 3 actions mainly take place. They are phonation, inspiration, and expiration. Like we all know, abduction is opening and adduction is closing. And here I've given like normal physiological actions where phonation, the cords come closer, inspiration, they move away, and expiration slightly come closer again. Here, 4 types of palsies we can see compared with the normal ones also. First comes unilateral abductor palsy. Actually, abductors, even with mild trauma, abductors are more affected than adductors. Abductor are supplied by recurrent laryngeal nerve. So we can see this as unilateral abductor palsy where recurrent laryngeal nerve is affected. The diagram which I have shown is a right-sided palsy. So in unilateral abductor palsy, during phonation, no much change will be there. It's like paramedian. It's 1.5 centimeter just beside. And during inspiration, right side remains the same, but left side moves, like abduction will be there. So the normal gap will be there, just mild hoarseness will be there, which will be compensated later. When it comes to bilateral abductor palsy, like both sides will be affected, only the abductors, recurrent laryngeal nerve. So here during phonation, no much change will be there. But during inspiration, both the vocal cords come together because abduction is not there. They are approximated together. So this causes dyspnea, like respiratory distress will be there. and the position is paramedian. Unilateral complete paralysis. Here, if right side is paralyzed, the one which I've shown is right side. Here, the opposite side, normal, not paralyzed side, will come to this side, come to the right side, and both move towards the right side. That is cadaveric position. And during inspiration, right side will be normal, but the non-paralyzed side will be moving towards. So the ample amount of gap will be there. Just aphonia will be there, mild dyspnea, not much will be there. And then bilateral complete paralysis. Here both sided and both abductors and adductors will be paralyzed. Here during phonation, they don't come closer. So the gap will be there, which causes aphonia. And during inspiration, they move. The abductors will, like, slight movement will be there. So it doesn't cause any respiratory depression. So I want to tell, bilateral abductor palsy is more dangerous than bilateral complete palsy. The treatment will be like tracheostomy in bilateral paralysis, but unilateral paralysis, we can wait and watch. It can be compensated later. That's all. Left recurrent laryngeal nerve is more likely to injure than right recurrent laryngeal nerve, because this is in close proximity to the intrathoracic structures as it crosses the aortic arch.
See, the first description about the position, instead of you are drawing the phonation, inspiration, expiration, it will be worthwhile if you draw what are all the various positions of the vocal cord. See, the vocal cord can be in the median position, in the paramedian position, in the cadaveric position, and lastly in the abducted position. These are the 4 positions that you can they can occupy. Okay, that can be mentioned as an initial, so that it can be easy to describe the various changes that happen when there is palsy. And next answer you can write is, what are all the different types of palsies? It can be partial unilateral, complete unilateral, partial bilateral, complete bilateral. These are the 4 types that you normally come across. Okay, unilateral partial, unilateral complete, bilateral partial, bilateral complete. Okay, these are the 4 types that happen, and it is the bilateral partial is the most dangerous, because abductors will be paralyzed and adductors will be only acting, and that will be causing complete obstruction. Okay, so that is the most dangerous. So after mentioning all these things, the question says you have to draw the views of the palsies as per the laryngoscopic view. For that, you have drawn all the pictures, and then you can go on to describe each one and describe how it is been sitting. Okay, so in that way it can be completed, but otherwise this is a beautiful presentation. Okay, thank you. Okay. Vasanthi, you want to add anything?
No, sir. I think she said everything, sir.
Yeah. Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, madam. Thank you, Dr. Hanna.
Yeah, you can close your screen, ma. Right. Okay.
Next, we can move on to Dr. Sai Dikshit.
Is your audio all right, Sai?
Dr. Sai Dikshit. Are you ready with your presentation? We can start fresh.
Yes, sir. Can you audible, sir?
Yeah, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sir, I'm starting from, my question is clinical anatomy of nasal cavity and clinical
anatomy or clinical anatomy?
Applied anatomy of nasal cavity, applied anatomy of larynx, and how would you anesthetize a 40 years old man for awake nasotracheal intubation, sir?
Yeah, go ahead.
Applied anatomy of nasal cavity, sir. First, I'm going to tell how it will be in nasal cavity normal patient. During inspired air, the inspired air is humidified by high water content and warmed by rich plexus of capillaries, sir. And ciliated mucosal cells remove contaminated mucus and turbinates increases mucosal area 1.6 centimeter square for humidification and enhanced air turbulence and help filter air. During exhalation, reclaims heat and moisture and minimizes heat and moisture loss, sir. In but these things differ in endotracheal intubation, sir. Because the tube is bypassed and so as to maintain the humidity of the inside air and humidifier should be used, sir. Normally, inhaled gas at room air temperature at OT room, it have no or little humidification, sir. So should be warmed to body temperature and saturated with water vapor. In tracheal intubation, with high fresh gas flow bypasses this humidification system, exposing lower airways to dry at less than 10 centimeters of water room temperature gases, sir. By exposing this dry air prolonged leads to dehydration of mucus, altered ciliary function, inspission of secretions, and particularly in underlying lung diseases, there will be atelectasis and VVQ mismatch, sir. Next, applied anatomy of the larynx, sir.
1 minute. Before you go on to the applied anatomy, the question is applied anatomy of the nose, right? So you
Yes,
never said anything about the anatomy of the nose, okay?
What is it?
What is it? Nose extends from the nostrils to the nasopharynx. What all does it contain? Where is the turbinate? Where are the sinuses? Where is the auditory opening? What happens to the thing? What is the nerve supply? What is the blood supply? Why should we? It's an applied anatomy, isn't it? We're talking about applied anatomy, clinical applied anatomy. So unless you know if it's an anatomy, so that's what you said physiology. You said about the humidification. And then if you put a nasotracheal tube, that humidification is lost. Things
This
like
is
that.
normal function
never
of
said
the
anything
nose
about
that you
anatomy.
described.
What about the turbinates?
Why should you know
That was
the
not discussed.
position of the turbinates? What is the importance of knowing the turbinates? How many turbinates are there?
3 turbinates, sir.
3 turbinates. What is the
Yes.
gap between the turbinates is called?
Meatus, sir.
So what is the importance? The part of the question is how are you going to do an nasotracheal intubation? Does it have any connection with that? How are you going to do a 40-year-old man nasotracheal intubation is the next part of the question. So the first half, is it related to this? Second half or not unrelated? When you want to talk about, and what is the importance of septum? If there is a deviation of the septum and you plan for a nasal intubation, how do you know which nostril to select? Isn't it?
Yes, sir.
Septum is absolutely important. Without talking about septum, anatomy of the nasal cavity is absolutely
Do you
incomplete.
have ENT
And also
surgeries
the nerve
happening in
supply.
your
Nerve
hospital?
supply is so important.
Sai Dikshit, do you
Sir?
do ENT tonsillectomies in your hospital?
Yes, sir.
So how do you intubate, orally or nasally?
Nasally, sir.
Nasally. So how do you know that which nostril you can introduce the tube easily? How do you do that? How do you select the nostril?
Selecting the big wider open nostril with have to see whether patient having a DNS or not. We have to select opposite side of the.
So that is applied anatomy. Okay, that is what you have to mention there. Okay, what you have mentioned is a physiological function of the nose. That is also part of it. When you bypass that, you can mention that. But to start with, you must describe only the structural things which are going to be problematic. Okay, the turbinates are important for packing the nose to produce local anesthesia for awake intubation or any fiber optic intubation. All these things when you want to do, or introducing a nasal fibroscope, nasoendoscopy. For all these things to anesthetize the nose, you must know where to place the local anesthetic. You cannot just take a long gauze piece, dipped in local anesthesia and stuff it into the nose. Okay, there is a proper method of doing that. But in between the turbinates, you have to pack that gauze piece and then towards the septum and towards the ethmoidal region And sometimes you can puncture the ethmoid and you cause trauma to the brain also when you do a nasal intubation, if you do not know all this anatomy. So as Dr. Madam said, you must first describe all the anatomical structures, okay? And then the nerve supply is very important. What are all the nerves supplying the nasal cavity? Branches of which
Okay, the
main cranial nerve?
nasopharynx is by the nasopharynx is supplied by the trigeminal nerve, right? And the oropharynx is supplied by what nerve?
Hypoglossal nerve.
No, glossopharyngeal nerve.
Okay,
Then
so
you have the laryngopharynx, larynx and the pharynx, which will be supplied by the vagus. So you have all the three nerves supplying it. You have the trigeminal, you have the glossopharyngeal, you have the vagus. So to block this, to give anesthesia for doing a blind nasal or a fiber optic bronchoscopy intubation, you need to block all of them, isn't it?
Yes,
So
sir.
that is why we use this topical anesthesia to numb the nose by using the pack, with xylocaine with adrenaline, or we use some Otrivin sometimes if we do not want to use adrenaline because of the cardiac patient or if it's a hypertensive patient, we use xylocaine with Otrivin. Otrivin is xylometadine, which is a vasoconstrictor. And there we go between the turbinates. You have to go between the middle and the inferior turbinate and must make sure that you do not injure the sinuses which drain the ostia through the ostia inside. And between the turbinates, there'll be ostia. Those sinuses will be draining into it. So when you do the packing or when you try to intubate or you put a nasogastric tube or a Ryle's tube into the nose, you must make sure that you do not go to the base of skull, because that's just the base of skull there, isn't it? So you
Yes.
need to understand. That is why we ask about the applied anatomy of the nose and the nasopharynx and the oropharynx. So that is the applied anatomy. Okay. And without nerve supply, it is absolutely incomplete.
damage to the
What is the
turbinate
largest space in the nasal cavity?
Yeah.
Is between the inferior turbinate and the floor of the nose. And that is the route
Yeah.
where you put the fiber optic bronchoscope to intubate. Okay.
Okay.
So that is why when you put a airway also, you must direct it straight back along the floor and not up the nose. If you go up the nose, like sir said, you will enter into the brain. Okay. So that is the applied anatomy.
And another practical point you can add is whenever you want to do a nasotracheal intubation, it is better to soften the tube by dipping it in the warm water. Conventional disposable tubes, PVC tubes, which now we are using, they are more little rigid tubes. So either you can use the ivory tube, which is more pliable, or you can soften the PVC tubes. I always do that. After anesthetizing the nose, I always dip it in warm water to make it a little more softer so that, and lubricate it adequately so that it slides without causing injury. Trauma to the, because it's a richly vascular area, any forceful insertion into the nasal cavity will cause a lot of bleeding, and that will completely obscure the view. And whether you go for fiber optic or the conventional nasal intubation with a laryngoscopy, you will be completely obscured because the whole pharynx will be flooded with blood. Okay, and that can get aspirated also. So these preparations are all very important for nasotracheal intubation, which you have to mention in your applied anatomy itself. Okay, right. Go ahead.
One minute. There's another one important point about the nasal septum, which is usually never in the midline, like it's supposed to be. And sometimes anteriorly, it will be deviated to one side, and you will think you'll be able to pass it through that side. But posteriorly, it will be deviated to the other side.
That's right.
So in such cases, it will be difficult for you to enter. After you put in from the anterior aspect, it will be difficult for you to enter into the posterior aspect because that posteriorly, it will be deviated to the opposite side. Those cases, we will have to assess them prior to these patients, prior to anesthesia, using an endoscopy. So that is a much better method of assessing the nasal airway of the nasal cavity than anything else. Okay, just keep that in mind.
Okay.
So these are all the points that you have to write for the nasal cavity applied anatomy. Now go on to the larynx. What are the applied anatomy points you have to mention for larynx?
In this also I didn't mentioning
Mention
about
the anatomy. Okay. So what are the structures? At least, okay, you first read what you have written, then we'll go to the discussion. Complete what you have written.
we have to look out some causes, what are the difficulties we are going to face in intubation, sir, in larynx. Subglottic stenosis, sir. Congenital malformations of the cricoid cartilage result in severe narrowing of the airway and respiratory obstruction. This leads to subglottic stenosis. Other causes are trauma, scarring after prolonged ET tube intubation, in particularly in newborns and ICU, in some cases of ICU, sir. And other situation is laryngocele. This is mucus-filled cavity leads to obstruction of the ventricular adytus by inflammation, scarring, and tumor, sir. This laryngocele by way there is expanding. There are two terms: internal laryngocele and external laryngocele. Internal laryngocele it is extending into the paraglottic space and area epiglottic fold, sir. And external laryngocele through thyrohyoid membrane to presenting it as a lump in the neck, sir. And other things is injuries in of the laryngeal nerves, sir. External branch of the superior laryngeal nerve. Actually, this nerve ascending over the inferior constrictor of the pharynx and immediately deep into the superior thyroid artery and vein. As this pass to the superior part of the gland, at these sites the nerve may be damaged in the securing these vessels during the thyroidectomy, and these muscles and this nerve paralysis leads to hoarseness, sir. And recurrent laryngeal nerve, most common side is left side. This is close relation to the inferior thyroid artery, sir. During thyroidectomy and benign and malignant enlargement of thyroid gland and enlarged thyroid nodules and cervical trauma leads to this recurrent laryngeal nerve, sir, injury. And most commonly left recurrent laryngeal nerve injury will occur, sir. May be involved in thoracic causes like malignant tumor of the lung, esophagus, and malignant nodes, sir. And during mitral stenosis patients also will see in left recurrent laryngeal nerve injury, sir, due to compression of the left pulmonary artery and aortic arch. And unilateral complete paralysis of recurrent laryngeal nerve is asymptomatic and having hoarseness of voice. And this hoarseness of voice become less severe with time and maybe permanent, sir. And no risk of any aspiration. Bilateral recurrent laryngeal nerve leads to complete loss of vocal power, and vocal folds are in cadaveric position between adduction and abduction. Valve-like obstruction during inspiration, sir, leads to dyspnea and marked inspiratory stridor. There is a respiratory obstruction after thyroidectomy due to direct trauma to the thyroid cartilage, especially in cancer of the thyroid, causing tracheomalacia. We have to take care of hemorrhage, sir, due to these hemorrhages in the neck deep in the investing fascia, causing external pressure on the trachea leads to respiratory obstruction, sir, after thyroidectomy. And hemorrhages in the intact gland also leads to respiratory obstruction, sir, by producing laryngeal edema than by direct compression, sir.
So
So what is
even that.
And enlarged glands still.
What is your question? What is your question for the second half?
Tracheomalacia, does it come under laryngeal anatomy? What are the components of the larynx?
Where is larynx located, first of all? When you talk about anatomy, you must first say that the larynx is located. Where is it located?
Which corresponding cervical vertebra we always describe in terms of?
Where is it in the adult? Where is it in the child?
You must have some bony points where you have to, you cannot say anything, so skin and the soft tissues cannot be taken as a landmark. You must have some bony landmarks so that you can know from which extent to which extent it is larynx and what are all the components are cartilages which make the larynx?
What are the unpaired cartilages? What are the paired cartilages? So without all that, what are the unpaired cartilages? Huge cartilages of the larynx.
Thyroid,
You have the cricoid,
thyroid, cricoid,
thyroid,
cricoid,
and
cricoid.
epiglottis. Cricoid, thyroid, and epiglottis. Okay.
Three
Three
paired and
pairs of
three unpaired.
paired cartilages.
Arytenoid,
Arytenoids,
cuneiform,
corniculate, and
corniculate.
cuneiform. You must know all this. Then what is a hyoid? Hyoid, though it is not technically part of the larynx, it provides the muscular attachment. Without that, it cannot move, isn't it?
Yes,
So
ma'am.
you must talk something about the cricoid, thyroid, epiglottis. Very, very important to talk about the epiglottis. And why is it important to know about the arytenoid cartilages, corniculate, cuneiform? Why are we bothered about that?
Visualize during laryngoscopy and the insertion of tube, we are having scoring regarding that.
Yes, you must know. That is what is called applied anatomy. Okay. Then what are the ligaments of the larynx? You never said anything about the ligaments. You never said about the extrinsic ligaments, intrinsic ligaments. Then of course, you're very, very think about the laryngeal sac and other things because that is not so important. Like we don't come across laryngoscele and all that so commonly, isn't it? We have a laryngeal cavity, and you have the vestibule, you have the middle part of the laryngeal cavity, and then you have the infraglottic space. All that is there. But we don't talk so much about the laryngocele. That is not the applied anatomy, right? What is important to us?
So you can mention about the subglottic area, cricoid area, where the mucosa
Yes.
is so loose, and that is a vulnerable area for developing an edema and a post-extubation stridor. Okay, so those are the important points that you have to mention. And what are the types of injuries that you can create by, you can dislocate the arytenoid, you know that you can
Intubation, correct.
Yeah, during intubation. Okay, and in rheumatoid arthritis, arytenoid joints can be affected, and patient may have stridor, and after intubation or extubation, they can go for an unanticipated difficult problem of maintaining the normal breathing. Okay, so that assessment becomes very important in a rheumatoid arthritis patient. Okay, so these are all the points that you have to mention, right? You can modify that answer and complete it, right?
Okay.
All right. Go to the other half now. How do you anesthetize a 40-year-old man for awake nasotracheal intubation? That is the other part of the answer. I mean question.
Awake nasotracheal intubation, sir. Indications for this are need for a definite airway and oral access not an option like in situations like trismus and trauma, etc. And in imminent respiratory failure and unable to align for oral intubation. And contraindications for nasotracheal intubations are apnea and nasal maxillary facial trauma and any coagulopathy. And complications for awake nasal intubations are epistaxis and vomitor aspiration may there's a risk of, sir. And first there are first you have to set up, sir. I have to examine patient and have to counsel the patient, sir. First examine both nostrils, sir, to determine which is large, and how to visualize whether patient in a sniffing position. Tube should be selected 0.5 to 1 mm smaller than the oral, sir. And topical anesthesia with lignocaine and vasoconstrictor, and lubricating the tube must be keep ready, sir. And as usual monitors should be keep ready, sir. Another if it is failed, we have to be ready for fiber optic intubation, sir. And we have to counsel and inform the patient regarding the procedure, and inform the patient during during insertion may feel gagging and coughing reflex and have to resist, and reassure and calm the patient, sir. Technique of the nasotracheal tube intubation, sir. examine both nostrils, sir, and we have to see which is larger, and spray, sir. The term is spray as you pass, sir. Nasal passages and block the throat, sir. And with an appropriate topical anesthesia and vasoconstrictor, sir, in order to numbness the mucosa and reduce bleeding. For intubation, we are using Gylocaine jelly and Gylocaine jelly, sir, to numbness air. If we need, we can use nasal airway, sir. And we have to pre-oxygenate the patient with 100% oxygen, and keep the patient on oxygen and for 3 minutes, and check the balloon of the appropriate sized nasotracheal tube, sir. And lubricate the distal 4 centimeters of the with xylo jelly, sir. And position of the head is midline and neutral position, sitting or supine position, sir. Insert the tube towards occipital protuberance, sir. Do not aim towards the vertex. Advance the tube with bevel faced towards septum, sir. If a tube is not passed in one side, have to try other side, sir. As soon as reaching towards the posterior nasopharynx, we will feel resistance, sir. Then we have to do gentle manipulation. Turn the nasopharynx 90 degrees, and at any cost, we should not force the tube inside, sir. As soon as the tube enters into the oral pharynx, we have to pay attention that whether we can able to hear sounds at the proximal end, sir. We have to auscultate proximal end listening for breath sound, sir. As soon as we can hear, we can easily insert the tube into the larynx, sir. And we have to confirm by auscultating both sides, and have to see whether any bleeding during intubation it might cause. And we have to stop by pinching the nostrils, sir.
Next.
Over, sir.
Dr. Sai, I think it is, your answer is quite incomplete. Very sorry to say. I think I have to say it straight on your face, because the question is how to anesthetize the nasal cavity for blind nasal intubation, right? Okay, it's okay to say about indication, contraindication, all that is okay. But you never said anything about how to anesthetize the upper airway. So what are the methods of anesthetizing the upper airway? So you have different types. You have, what is the percentage of jelly? It is a percentage of jelly?
4% of jelly.
No.
Every day you are using it in your theater. Do you see the 4% there?
10% is jelly, sir.
Spray. That is a spray.
Don't keep guessing. You have 2% xylocaine jelly. You have 2% xylocaine ointment, but you're using a jelly because it is water soluble. You want to use a jelly. Okay, that's 2%. Next is you can use 4% spray. 4% means what? How many milligrams per ml?
40.
What is 2%? What is 4%? What is 5%? What is 10%?
42, sir.
40%. Yeah, 40 milligram per ml. Okay.
40 milligram per ml. Okay. Next is you have a spray. You have 10% spray. So 10% spray will be 100 milligram per ml, right? So
yes,
you have to calculate the amount of local anesthetic that you're going to use on a patient to anesthetize the upper airway. So if a patient weighs 50 kgs, how much of xylocaine can you use? With adrenaline, without adrenaline?
5 mg per kg with adrenaline, ma'am. Without adrenaline, 7 mg per kg with adrenaline, ma'am.
3 milligram per kg without adrenaline, 7 to 8 milligram per kg with adrenaline.
Yes,
So if you're using xylocaine with adrenaline for a pack, you must calculate the amount of local anesthetic that you're using, because you're going to use various percentages of the local anesthetic to anesthetize the upper airway. So how are the methods of anesthetizing the upper airway? First, you said you can use xylocaine jelly in the nostrils. You can use it on both the nostrils. Okay. So maybe you'll use about 5 ml of the xylocaine jelly in both the nostrils. Next,
spray.
what will you do? You said
Spray.
you're going to use xylocaine with xylometadine drops or xylocaine with adrenaline soaked in, and you're going to pack the nostrils. Okay. And nasal cavity is an area where the local anesthetic can get absorbed very easily. Okay. It is like an intravenous injection. It can absorb very easily. So if you use it with adrenaline, it will take time to absorb. So it is okay to use it. But you must be careful about the amount of xylocaine that you're using for local anesthetizing the upper nasal cavity. Next is the spray. You're using the spray. Where are you using the spray?
Outside the
The
OT.
oropharynx. The oropharynx, you can use 10% spray. You can use 2 puffs on both sides. Okay, that itself will make it quite a bit, isn't it? 100 on 2 sides. If you use it, you'll get 200 milligrams there itself. So you must calculate the amount of local anesthetic that you're using on a patient. After calculating and keeping ready the amount of local anesthetic, you must plan to anesthetize the upper airway. So these are all the methods of anesthetizing the upper airway. This is what is expected of your answer. After that, you will tell about the technique of doing a blind nasal intubation. Okay, so no point saying about every other thing without talking about how to anesthetize the upper airway. So when talking about the blind nasal intubation, you can, of course, you said about the indication, contraindication, all that you can say. But what you said is correct. What you go from the nasopharynx to the oropharynx, you will find resistance, and then you enter the oropharynx. Once you enter the oropharynx and you start hearing the breath sounds, you must make sure that you don't traumatize while you enter into the glottis. So at that level, where you're entering the glottis, at that level, you might have to spray a little more. Spray as you go technique, when you're using a fiber optic bronchoscope, is much easier than trying to spray and doing a blind nasal intubation. Okay. So this kind of without explaining about how to anesthetize the upper airway, you cannot go ahead and do a blind nasal intubation. Okay. What you said, other things are right, keeping the bevel. And sir already said at the beginning of the thing itself, he said about making the tube a little softer. Put it in warm water, but even if you put it in warm water and put it back to the patient, make sure it is not hot. Okay. It should be warm, made it soft, and it should come back to room temperature before you try to intubate the patient. Okay. So it should not become stiff again. At the same time, it should not be hot while you try to intubate. Okay. So these are the few clues that you have. And practical methods of what I can give you is a practical method of doing this is, if you are a right-handed person and if you're able to enter into the right nostril, this is just a practical tip for you. If you close the left nostril, then the intubation will be much easier because the patient will breathe much better because one nostril is already blocked. So once he breathes much better, the intubation becomes easier. Okay. So these are the things which you need to talk about.
So my additional suggestion to this question, Sai, will be, this question says 40-year-old man for awake nasotracheal intubation. So patient is going to be conscious, okay? And it is a nasotracheal intubation. There are 2 parts in that. When a patient is going to be conscious and you are going to pass a tube through his nose into his respiratory tract, he will be very anxious. He will be sometimes may not cooperate also. So in order to get the full cooperation and rapport of the patient, you must discuss the thing with the patient and get his full cooperation. Okay. You must explain the procedure to him, what he is likely to experience, and then have a good lengthy discussion with him, and then convince him that it will be a painless procedure and it will be least discomforting by application of all local anesthetic agents. Okay, that assurance should be given to the patient. And most importantly, what I would always, in my experience with the plastic surgery unit for a long number of years, where I have done plenty of these intubations, tell the patient that once the tube goes into the trachea, patient will not be able to phonate. Okay, that's a very, very important instruction that you should tell the awake patient, because I had one case of an IAS officer coming for neck surgery with a contracture, and I have to do a blind intubation, and I succeeded in my first attempt in passing the tube. But the patient started throwing up his hands and said actions that he is not able to do anything. And being an IAS officer, immediately he asked for a paper and pencil, said, give me this. So we gave him a paper and pencil and he wrote, I can't speak. And from that time onwards, I started telling every patient that until the tube is there in your throat, you cannot speak and you will not be able to phonate. Only after I remove that. So I have to convince him that. So tell all these points to the patient and first of all, win his assurance. If the patient is very anxious and jittery, plan for a mild anxiolytic like IV midazolam and apply all the monitors. Keep all the emergency airway equipments ready before you plan a nasal intubation in an awake patient. And then the second half, you can say awake intubation can be done as a blind intubation or under vision. This is the second description that you have to say. And then go on to do, if it is awake blind intubation, then as Madam said, you have to know the nerve supply of the various areas of the nose, how you block each and every type of testing, what are all the dosage of local anesthetic that you use, what is the difference between viscous xylocaine and aqueous xylocaine, where you use viscous, where you use aqueous, why do you use a vasoconstrictor, all these points you can mention. And in awake blind nasal intubation, it is mainly guided by the sound of the breathing. It is not, you are not seeing anything. So it is the patient's breathing. So the instruction that you have to give the patient in advance if you are planning for a blind is to breathe harshly and heavily with an open mouth and a tongue protruded so that he won't be able to swallow. If he swallows, what will happen? The tube will go towards the esophagus and it will not go towards the trachea. So what I practice is always is ask the patient to open the mouth and breathe and put out the tongue and breathe and not swallow at all during the procedure. If you take these three things, and once you reach the larynx, if the larynx is adequately anesthetized, it will easily go through without any struggle. Only inadequate anesthesia of the larynx, patient will cough, buck, he will hold the breath, he will not cooperate. And once or twice you have induced stimulation with a partially anesthetized larynx, patient will become very restless. So the main success lies in anesthetizing the laryngeal inlet correctly. That is the most important thing for a successful blind intubation. But when it comes to the question of fiber optic intubation, you are going to load the tube with a fibroscope and as spray as you go is the technique that is also asked as a short note question in your theory paper. Okay, there you are not going to have the trouble of packing and removing and all these things. So initially you spray the nasal cavity and then as you go you spray, and that is a much more easier, but that is under direct vision and you will be completely assured of correct entry into the trachea. Whereas in blind it is by the muffling of the sound or absence of the sound after you go into the trachea. And the most important question that you asked after in blind nasal intubation is to ask to make the patient tell his name. If he is not able to phonate, your tube is in trachea. If he tells his name, your tube is not in trachea. Okay, that is how I always test the placement of the tube. Okay, so these are all the points that you can mention. So classify that into.
Another important thing, sir, is to give supplementary oxygen.
Yes.
If you sedate the patient with midazolam or dexmed, you might have to give supplementary oxygen through the opposite nostril. And you can pass a fine catheter in the opposite nostril up to the nasopharynx and give about 2 to 3 liters of oxygen through that. In that case, you will never get a complication of a hypoxia at any point of time. Whether you're doing a fiber optic or whether you're doing a blind nasal, if you're sedating the patient and you think that the patient is getting slightly hypoxic and you're not able to oxygenate the patient, this is one method of giving supplementary oxygen to the patient.
And working suction is always a must, and giving and antixylagogues is a controversial subject. Some people give glycopyrrolate before doing the procedure. Some people don't give. So there are both advantages and disadvantages. Glycopyrrolate, if you give, it will make the whole area dry without any secretions, but patient will be finding it little uncomfortable. But if you don't give, some patients will have a lot of copious secretions, but they say that local anesthetic will spread faster if there are normal secretions. So the area anesthetized will be much larger compared to a patient who has received glycopyrrolate and have a dry mucosa. Okay, so that point also you can be mentioned. Right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Next question.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, madam. we'll move on to the next question. It's by Dr. Pratik Shukla. What are the differences between neonatal and adult larynx? Discuss the anatomy of diaphragm and how does it behave under different stages of anesthesia. Over to Dr. Pratik Shukla.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, ma'am. Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you are audible.
Sir, so my question has three parts. So beginning with the first part, what are the differences between neonatal and adult larynx? I have prepared in tabulation form, sir. So going ahead, neonates mainly function in neonates of larynx is the airway protection and the respiration, while in adults primary function is airway protection along with respiration, while secondary function is phonation, assistance in swallowing, and fixation of the chest by the upper airway, sir. Neonatal larynx size it is a smaller size as compared to adult. Length is around 12 mm, while width of the neonatal larynx is around 17 mm. At the glottic level, that is the vocal fold level, the newborn larynx is approx 1/3 of the adult, and the size size grows according as the age advances. And it's mostly in the first 18 months of the life, sir. And there is no as such difference in the gender and size difference in the size according to the gender. While in case of adults, sir, size is different according to the gender. And in adult male, it is vertical is 44 mm, while in females it is 36 mm. While AP size of adult male is 36 mm, while of female is 26 mm, sir. And the adult larynx is 1/3 of the vocal cord is cartilaginous. The rest is the membranous. While of neonate, half of the infant vocal cord length is cartilaginous, and because of the presence of arytenoid, rest other is membranous. Narrowest part in the neonatal larynx is the subglottic region, that is the cricoid region, while in adult, narrowest part is the glottic region. Therefore, we have to be vigilant after passing the ET tube. If the ET tube passes a vocal cord in the neonates, after that also we have to be vigilant because the narrowest part is the subglottic region. In neonates, larynx is situated higher in the neck. That is in preterm infants. It is situated around at the level of C3 vertebra, while in term infants, it is at junction of C3 C4, and this is this level of high larynx provides a seal, so is adequate, and the baby can suck the milk accordingly, sir. While in case of adult cricoid means adult larynx is at the level of C5, and larynx is more caudal as compared to the neonate. And something about the epiglottis. The soft palate opposes the tip of the epiglottis in case of neonate, therefore naturally obstructing the oral airway. Thus, we can say neonates are the obligate nasal breather in first few weeks of their life. So, as an anesthetist, as this larynx is on the higher side and epiglottis is situated at the higher level, as soon as we touch the epiglottis, it can result in intense laryngospasm in case of neonates. While in adults, their low level of epiglottis, and being said that after doing tongue depression, laryngospasm is not as such the problem in adults. In neonates, the mucosal layer of the larynx is more prominent, and therefore relatively epiglottis, aryepiglottic fold and tissue of the arytenoid seems thick, and therefore it gives a characteristic omega shape appearance, which is a normal thing in the neonates. And the angle between the epiglottis and vocal cord is more acute in infants, therefore it makes difficult for direct laryngoscope visualization. Thus, we use straight blade for laryngoscopy in case of neonates and infants. Along with this, sir, the occiput is also prominent in case of neonates as compared to adult. Therefore, during intubation, we don't go for sniffing the morning ear position, just neutral head position of the neonates is advocated, sir. So, completed the difference between neonate and adult larynx.
Yeah, first, before you elaborately mentioned about the sizes, length, so many millimeters and all. First, you start with the position location, okay, corresponding to the cervical level, which vertebral level. It is always higher up in the neonate and infants compared to the adult. Okay, that is the most important thing. And it is the epiglottis is next part of the larynx, which is most different thing from the adult. And the gap between the epiglottis and the base of the tongue is very minimal. That is why you have to go for a straight blade. Whereas in the adult, you use the Macintosh curved blade, which goes into the vallicula. Okay, there is a small gap between these two. That is not there. As the child grows, only that gap will develop. So it is that point also has to be brought out. And you can draw the diagram how the funnel shape will be there in the
Yes, sir.
if infant and how the broad one will be there in the adult. Okay, so that also will make the answer much more clearer, right?
Yes, sir.
Right. The next part is the anatomy of the
Anatomy.
diaphragm.
Yes, sir. Anatomy of the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a muscle which separates the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity. Therefore, it is also called as thoraco-abdominal diaphragm. It is the principal muscle of respiration. It is dome-shaped and consists of muscular part and the central fibrous part that is known as central tendon. Origin of diaphragm. It mainly originates from three parts. That first one is the sternal, second is the costal, third one is the vertebral. Sternal part again can be divided as sternal part posterior to the xiphoid process. Two slips originate and it inserts in the central tendon. While the costal part on each side, it consists of 6 fleshy rings or slips which arises and from the lower 6 ribs near the costal cartilages and it gets inserted into the central tendon. While the vertebral part can be divided into two further divisions, cruras and the ligaments. There are two cruras, left and right cruras, and 5 ligaments. The right crura is longer than the left crura because of the presence of liver. So more attachment or more strength is required. While ligaments are, there are 5 arcuate ligament. First is the median arcuate ligament, that is the U shape connecting the two cruras. Second is the two median arcuate ligament, which is present, medial arcuate ligament, which is present on the either side of the diaphragm, and two lateral arcuate ligament, which is present lateral to the medial arcuate ligaments. Insertion. From circumferential origin, the muscle fiber converges to inwards and it inserts in the central tendon and surface and the relation. Superior surface of the diaphragm that has the dome and it projects in the either side of the thorax and it is covered by the endothoracic fascia and it is related to the base of right and left pleura on the both of the sides and fibrous pericardium in the middle of the diaphragm. Inferior surface, it is lined by diaphragmatic fascia and the parietal peritoneum. On the right side, it is related to right lobe of the liver, right kidney and right adrenal gland, while left side it is related to left lobe of liver, stomach, fundus, spleen, left kidney and the left adrenal gland. So there are openings in the diaphragm which can be divided into two subheadings again, major opening and minor opening. There are 3 major openings. First one is the vena cava opening, which opens at the T8 level. It is a quadrangular or square shaped opening located at the central tendon towards the right side of the median plane, and through it passes the vena cavas, inferior vena cava and the right phrenic nerves. Second opening is the esophageal opening, that is at the level of T10. It is an oval shaped opening and it is slightly towards the left part of the diaphragm. And here the right crus splits around the opening and it acts like a pinchcock effect. It causes pinchcock effect. Structures passing through the esophageal opening are esophagus, both the vagus and the esophageal branch of the left gastric artery. And aortic opening. Aortic opening is at the T12 level and it's round shape and in the it is in the middle and behind the median arcuate ligament. Structures passing are the thoracic aorta, thoracic duct and the azygous veins. Minor openings, they are unnamed openings as such. It can be like space of Larry, a musculophrenic artery opening, a sympathetic chain opening, that just passes deep to the medial arcuate ligament, intercostal nerves and vessels. It is just piercing the diaphragm and supplying it to the diaphragm, subcostal nerves and vessels. Nerve supply of the diaphragm is left and right phrenic nerve, root value C3, C4, C5, both sensory and motor supply. Second nerve supply is lower five intercostal nerves. According to the nerve root, it will be T7 to T12. And third one is the subcostal nerve. Arterial supply is superior phrenic artery, inferior phrenic artery, pericardiophrenik artery, musculophrenic artery, and sometimes superior epigastric artery and lower five intercostal and subcostal artery also supply to the diaphragm. Lymphatic drainage is anterior diaphragmatic lymph node, posterior diaphragmatic lymph node, right lateral diaphragmatic lymph node, and the left lateral diaphragmatic lymph node. All those at the end drains towards the thoracic dexa. Action of the diaphragm, it is the primary muscle of respiration or inspiration, means it increases the vertical diameter of the thorax. Second one is second action is it is the muscle of abdominal straining, sir. It raises the intra-abdominal pressure, thus causes evacuation of the pelvic content like urine, feces, and during parturition also it is a very potent muscle, sir. Third thing, it acts as a support to the vertebral muscles for weight lifting, heavy weight lifting. Fourth, it acts as a sphincter for the esophagus, thus inhibiting the vomiting impulse. Development, embryological part of the diaphragm means it is derived from four structures: septum transversum ventrally, pleuroperitoneal membrane, dorsal mesentery of the esophagus, and body wall periphery, sir. Broadly speaking about the disease which is related to diaphragm is hernia, diaphragmatic hernia. It can be divided into two heads, congenital and acquired. Congenital is posterolateral, means types of congenital diaphragmatic hernia are posterolateral diaphragmatic hernia, which is the most common one, retrosternal diaphragmatic hernia, and the paraesophageal diaphragmatic hernia, sir. While acquired is traumatic diaphragmatic hernia and hiatal hernia, that is also called as sliding hernia. So finish the part of
yeah, that's more of a pathological thing that need not be, I think, included in the anatomy. Maybe it can be mentioned as an applied anatomy. You can just mention that. But one, that's a very standard question. So all the points that you have mentioned are all available readily in any book. And the only thing you have to remember and write and draw a good diagram also. One more point I think you can add to this is what are the types of muscle fibers the diaphragm is made up of? Because muscle, this is a peculiarity about diaphragm is it is partly volitional and partly involuntary. Okay,
yes,
you can hold your breath for some time by not acting the diaphragm, but beyond a particular time you cannot hold it. That is the most important peculiarity about the musculature of that. And there are two types of muscle fibers, type 1 and type 2, fast and slow. That point you have to mention especially because that is a more valid clinical point. You know, when person, especially the work of breathing depends on the type, athletes, they all develop the muscles which can work for a long time without getting tired. Okay, so that is a more important applied anatomy compared to all the other points. So that if you add, I think you will get full marks for that, for what you have prepared. Okay, right. You can go to the next half now, third half, third point, third part of that question.
Sir, sorry, sir, this part I have not prepared so well because I did not get any means a lot of material regarding this. But still,
that's a very tricky question. But let me see what you have written, and because I also try to analyze the answer for that, and I have formed a particular idea because none of the books can give any concrete answer for that. Ready-made answer will not be available. But after referring to so many articles, I formed my own idea about the answer for this question. Okay, this is a little lateral thinking or out of the box question. So you have to use your imagination and try to answer this question. Let us see how we compare. Okay, you first tell me your answer, then I'll tell my answer. Okay, go ahead.
Sir, how diaphragm behaves under the different stages of anesthesia?
Behavior under different stages of anesthesia. Okay.
Yes, sir. So stage 1, that is stage of analgesia. It can be defined as beginning of induction of general anesthesia to the loss of consciousness. So most of the surgeries are performed in supine position, considering that. Therefore, diaphragm moves cephal head and thus decreasing the functional residual capacity when compared to the normal standing position, sir. Stage 2, stage of excitement, delirium, loss of consciousness to the onset of automatic breathing. Sir, in this, as such, automatic breathing means spontaneous breathing is itself present, but the tidal volume is decreased. So, we can say it is mainly because the diaphragmatic contractions are not very adequate, thus decreasing the tidal volume, sir. Third stage of surgical anesthesia, that is from onset of automatic respiration to respiratory paralysis. It can be further divided into 4 subplanes. Means only this much part only I got, and fourth one is the medullary paralysis, means we cannot...
coma. Okay, right. So that's a good interpretation of the wording in that particular question, because behavior under different stages of anesthesia. If you take that part of stages of anesthesia alone, naturally everybody will imagine that Gödel's stages of anesthesia. Sir Arthur Gödel, what he described as stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, plane 1, plane 2, plane 3, plane 4, and stage 4. All this progressive depression. Okay, that is what will be usually understood by that wording, stages of anesthesia. That is one way of answering. I won't say it is wrong also. But what I thought was, you can say that as you mentioned, most of the surgeries are done in the supine position. Okay, when a patient comes, majority of the time now nobody is going to operate on a standing patient. Most of the patients are going to lie down, either in the supine or in the prone position. So another way of describing these various stages of anesthesia, what I thought was a supine patient lying awake on the table. Okay, so what happens when compared to the erect position, when the diaphragm is at a lower level, there is a more easy excursion for the lungs to happen. Whereas when the patient comes to the operating table and lies on the table in a supine position, two things are happening. One is the abdominal contents try to push the diaphragm because there is no action on the gravity, and the restriction of the lung movement is happening. Okay, so the overall thoracic diameter and the space gets reduced. So that but the patient being conscious, he is able to maintain his respiratory gas exchanges because of his ability to breathe normally with the full power of the diaphragm, because that's the main muscle of inspiration. Unless he has got an associated cardiac or other issues, he will be finding it difficult to lie in the supine position. So once you start inducing anesthesia, the patient loses consciousness. The push of the diaphragm becomes more, the respiration becomes much more depressed, and the abdominal contents try to push the diaphragm much more. So the space in the diaphragmatic and the thoracic cavity gets much more reduced, and the basal portions of the lung do not expand as much as will happen in the. So you can draw diagrams how gradually the dome goes on increasing, or the cavity of the thorax getting reduced, so that is the major reason for the postoperative pulmonary complications, inadequate excursion of the diaphragm and the collapse of the lower portions of the lung. Atelectasis. And then once you paralyze the patient to take over the ventilation, the entire movement of the diaphragm is dependent on the anesthetist squeezing the bag and the tidal volume that you give and the pressure that you supply. Okay, so the entire control of the diaphragm is lost to the patient, and then you have to you do the ventilation according to the parameters that you set in the mechanical ventilator or by manual ventilation. Okay, so that is how there's another view of the way of thinking for the positions or behavior of the diaphragm. And if you allow the patient to spontaneously breathe under anesthesia, then the patient will have more work of breathing because of the pressure from the abdominal contents and the gravity not acting, and the descent will be restricted. So patient has to do more work, and with the anesthetic agents trying to suppress the respiratory center to avoid the pain, the hypoventilation chances are much more. Okay, so that point can, and you can describe the same thing with the prone position. What happens again in the supine? This is the problem. In prone position, unless you give a free movement for the abdominal muscles, then again the restriction can happen, and the pressure from the various support structures or the frames that you place to hold the patient, they also causes more amount of restriction, and that again is going to lead the decreased excursions of the diaphragm, and again that is another problem for reduced expansion of the lung. Okay, so that is what I thought can add. Apart from, initially I also thought about the various stages of anesthesia and what happens only, but later on reading one article which has been published in 1989, they have taken serial radiological pictures of what happens to the cavity of the size in their various stages of anesthesia, when the patient is awake, when the patient has been lost consciousness, when the patient has been intubated, and when the patient is in the neutral position, then head down position, head up position, like that they have taken. So after reading that article only, I got another idea that we can describe that in terms of various positions and various stages or various postures of the anesthesia also. Okay, that can also be taken as stages of anesthesia. Okay, so you can combine both and make a little more elaborate answer for that. That's what I think. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Santi, you have any other suggestions for that? Vasanti, are you there? Okay, right.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Pratik Shukla. Can we move on to the next question, sir?
Yeah, please.
Next question will be by Dr. Priyanka.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you are available? Okay. Dr.
Yes, sir, I am.
Priyanka from Annamalai Medical College, Rajamutte Annamalai Medical College.
Okay.
Over to Dr. Priyanka.
Yes, sir. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Today I'm presenting first topic is oxygen cascade. Definition: steps by which partial pressure of the oxygen decreases from a higher level at a sea level, which is 159.6 millimeters of mercury, that is around 160 millimeters of mercury in inspired gas, to 5 to 22 millimeters of mercury at the level of mitochondria where it is utilized. The steps which is taking place in this process: first, the oxygen in the air, which is 21%, which is entering into the lung, uptake in the lungs. Then from the lungs it is transported in the blood. From there, global delivery to all the tissues. Then regional distribution of O2 delivery, diffusion from capillary to the cells, cellular utilization of the oxygen. Same occurs in reverse direction for carbon dioxide. Factors influencing. The main significance of this cascade is, if there is any increase in size of any stage in this cascade, will increase the hypoxia at the mitochondrial level. Factors influencing oxygen cascade. First, dry atmospheric air, barometric pressure, FiO2, whichever we are using, and PiO2. Humidification at body temperature. Then inspired gas mixes with the existing alveolar gas. This causes the dilution of atmospheric air by already existing alveolar air. Then constant uptake of O2, diffusion defects. Next thing is arterial O2 tension, increase in the alveolar gradient, then a VQ mismatch due to the return of blood from bronchial veins and consumption by the myocardium. This is the true shunt of pulmonary blood. Then cardiac output. Cellular PO2 decreased from arteries when the oxygen is entering from artery to the vein. The partial pressure of O2 is decreasing, which is lowest at mitochondria. This depends fully on the blood flow, hemoglobin percentage, and the cardiac output. O2 consumption occurs at the mitochondrial level, but below 1 to 2 millimeters of mercury of partial pressure of oxygen, oxidative phosphorylation stops and the anaerobic metabolism sets in. This critical point where the partial pressure becomes less than 1 or 2, this is called partial point. Failure of the cascade. The reasons for failure of the cascade is stagnant hypoxia, which is due to decreased cardiac output, peripheral vascular disease, or occlusion. Then anemia, acute blood loss, hemoglobinopathies, hypoxic hypoxias, inadequate ventilation, VQ mismatch, or decreased FiO2. Shunts, maybe AV shunt, and the congenital cardiac disease. So this is my first one, sir. Shall I go to second one or?
First one, I think oxygen transport. That is how the question even to me started, isn't it? Oxygen transport, oxygen cascade, ODC curve,
Okay, sir.
oxygen toxicity. These are the four components of this question.
Okay, sir. I will explain the oxygen transport also, sir, now.
Yeah.
Intra-alveolar O2 tension is 106 millimeters of mercury. Venous blood in the pulmonary capillaries, it is 40 millimeters of mercury. Due to this pressure gradient, O2 diffuses from alveolo-capillary membrane. O2 in the blood, which is entering in two forms, which dissolves in plasma, only 0.3 ml per 100 ml of blood at a PaO2 of 100 millimeters of mercury. Remaining is combines with the hemoglobin. 97% of the oxygen combines with the hemoglobin. So 1 gram of fully oxygenated hemoglobin will carry 1.39 ml of oxygen. The binding of hemoglobin with oxygen, the bound form is called relaxed form, and the deoxygenated hemoglobin form is called bound form, which is tensed form. Deoxygenated hemoglobin increases the affinity. So in this, through this pathway, the CO2 is coming out of the cell to the lungs and to the environment. The O2 flux, amount of O2 leaving the left ventricle into the arterial blood. O2 flux is cardiac output into saturation into hemoglobin percentage into 1.31. Factors which affects O2 flux is cardiac output, saturation, hemoglobin. Any one alteration can be tolerated, but the combination of all the three cannot be tolerated, which can be seen in decreased the O2 flux will be decreased in case of congestive cardiac failure, anemia, metabolic acidosis, respiratory acidosis, and increased in case of exercise, thyrotoxicosis, halothane shake, pain, and shivering. Sir, next is oxygen distribution curve, sir.
Transport, you have said only half from alveoli to blood, you have said. But what
Yes,
about the delivery level at the tissue level? How is it getting delivered there? See, transport means taking it from one place and getting delivered at the other place. The entire thing, you know. So the oxygen carrying capacity and then how it goes and what are the factors which make it offload at the tissue level. That also you have to mention. Then only the answer will be complete. Okay?
Okay.
Right. Go ahead.
Oxygen dissociation curve, sir. Percentage of hemoglobin saturation with O2 at different partial pressure of O2 in the blood is described by oxygen distribution curve. X-axis, it denotes partial pressure of oxygen. Y-axis, it denotes hemoglobin saturation at a pH of 7.4, PCO2 of 40 millimeters of mercury, and temperature of 37 degrees Celsius. It is a sigmoid curve. In x-axis, partial pressure of O2 is marked till 100, and in y-axis up to the saturation of 100%. At the partial pressure of 100 millimeters of mercury, hemoglobin is 97% saturated with O2. At a partial pressure of 60 millimeters of mercury, hemoglobin is 90% saturated with O2. When the partial pressure falls below this, hemoglobin is getting desaturated rapidly, mainly below P50. Now, what is P50? Partial pressure at which 50% of the hemoglobin is saturated with O2, normally at 26.5 millimeters of mercury. The patient will become unconscious below this range. So below this value, the cellular hypoxia sets in. At steeper portion of the oxygen dissociation curve, a minimal alteration of PPO2 has a drastic effect in saturation. The lower the P2, the curve will shift to the left side. Lower the P50, the curve will shift to the left side. Higher the P50, the curve will shift to the right side. The factors which shifts the curve to the left side are increased in pH, which is alkalosis, decreased temperature, decreased CO2, decreased 2,3-BPG, methemoglobinemia, fetal hemoglobin, and carbon monoxide inhalation. Then the factors which shift to the right are decreased pH, which is acidosis, increase in temperature, increase in CO2, increase in 2,3-BPG, exercise, propranolol intake, and isoflurane. 2,3-BPG is a special intermediate of glycolysis in erythrocytes. Bohr effect, shift in position of ODC caused by decrease in pH or increase in CO2 is called Bohr effect. Main causes are respiratory or metabolic disturbances. Double Bohr effect, which was described by Hughes, transfer of H plus from fetal to maternal intervillous space causes a fetal pH 2 increase and increasing the affinity, that is shifting to the left. At the same time, H plus going to the maternal circulation decreases the pH of the mother and decreases affinity and shifts the curves to the right. This further releases the O2 from the maternal circulation to the fetal circulation. This is called double Bohr effect. Then comes to the storage of blood. Acid citrate dextrose takes 2 to 3 days to recover from decrease in 2,3 ppg. This shifts the curve to the left side. In case of CPD, it takes 10 days to recover. The function of 2,3 ppg takes 10 days to recover. Then O2 stores. Normal O2 store is about 1.5 liters, in which a lung consists of about 30%, hemoglobin 50%, and myoglobin 20%, and in few in body fluids. So in case O2 is in FRC becomes main source. So normal FRC in a previously room-mad person is 480 ml. This will be depleted by metabolic activity within 90 seconds. It can be increased by increasing the FiO2. This is the basics of pre-oxygenation. The main significance of ODC curve is ODC relates to the saturation of hemoglobin to PaO2. ODC relates O2 content to PO2. ODC relates O2 transport to peripheral tissues. ODC relates O2 availability to functions. So next is oxygen toxicity.
Yeah, one more thing you can clearly mention in this ODC curve is the
Yes, sir.
shift to the left prevents the release of the oxygen to the tissues, and
Yes, sir.
shift to the right favors the release of oxygen to the tissues. Okay,
Okay,
I
sir.
always remember or teach the students to remember it. Shift to the right is right for tissues. Shift to the left
Yes.
is wrong for tissues.
Wrong
It
for
will
tissue.
retain. Yeah.
Okay,
So, right. Otherwise, it's a straightforward question repeatedly asked. So all of you better learn that thoroughly. Right. Okay. Last part of this, oxygen toxicity.
Oxygen toxicity. Oxygen administered at a higher concentration than room air for a longer duration. This causes the oxygen toxicity. Main indication for oxygen supplementation is to treat or prevent hypoxia. Who are the patients who belongs high risk groups? Those on supplemental O2, that is 100% O2 for more than 8 to 12 hours. Infants and neonates, especially premature babies, hyperbaric O2 therapy, underwater divers, and patients on chemotherapeutic agents like bleomycin. The main mechanism is partial reduction of O2 by 1 or 2 electrons to form reactive oxygen species. What are the reactive oxygen species? Superoxide dismute, superoxide, hydroxyl radical, hydrogen peroxide, and hypochlorous acid. Protective factor: under normal circumstance, body is able to handle reactive ROS using antioxidants, but excessive production of ROS leads to toxic effect. Glutathione being the most effective antioxidant, others like vitamin C, E, catalase, superoxide dismutase. Harmful effects of these free radicals. These free radicals will cause lipid peroxidation of the membranes, increasing the permeability, damages the mitochondria, proteins oxidized and degraded, DNA is oxidized, and it leads to the breakage of DNA. Next comes the systemic effects of O2 toxicity. Pulmonary toxicity. First, it causes damage to the alveolar capillaries, which can lead to edema of the alveolar capillary membrane and atelectasis or atelectasis, then which leads to hypoxemia, acidosis, and death of the patients. Then retinal damage. Retinal damage is mainly due to the proliferation of the retinal vessels, retinopathy of prematurity. Erythrocyte damage, it can cause erythrocyte damage, renal causes, renal effects, hepatic effects, myocardial damage, endocrine damage. Then central nervous system, it causes twitching, convulsions, destruction of the neurons, which can lead to death of the patient. First, pulmonary effects. This is called a Lorentz-Smith effect, which can lead to ARDS, tracheobronchitis, absorption atelectasis. Earliest symptom is the substernal dyspnea, cough, and chest pain, and decreased vital capacity. Then CO2 narcosis in patients with the lung elements such as COPD, status asthmaticus, and respiratory depression. This causes an increase in the intracranial tension, which leads to swelling, twitching, drowsiness, convulsions, papilledema, and coma. Then CNS effect, which is a Paul-Bert effect. which produces symptoms like nausea, twitching, behavioral changes, irritability, anxiety, confusion, convulsions, and unconsciousness. Treatment for this is gradual or sudden withdrawal of high pressure O2 and allowing the patient to breathe room air. Then comes the retinopathy of prematurity, increase in the O2, that is more than 150 millimeters of mercury for more than 2 hours, constricts the retinal arterioles. This causes swelling and degeneration of the endothelium, which increases the angiogenic factors, which causes vascular proliferation. This produces proliferative retinopathy, which consists of stage 1 to 5, stage 1 and 2, which is reversible in like 2 to 3 months, stage 3, which can be reversed in more than or equal to 6 months. Stage 4 and 5, which is very severe, it may cause permanent blindness to the babies, especially the premature babies who are less than 30 weeks. Significance: when retinopathy of the prematurity patients taken up for surgery and especially in infants less than 44 weeks, saturation should be maintained between 87 to 92%. Nitrous should be avoided before injecting air bubble. Prevention of oxygen toxicity, use of lowest oxygen possible with lesser duration, earliest use of PEEP, use of glutathione, cysteine, vitamin C and E, acid-base correction. Yes, sir, I finished.
Yeah. So that's also a very straightforward question available in all that. But one more point you can add is how long you can give 100% oxygen, how soon you should give 80%, how soon you can give 60 and 50 for. So normally you can give 100% oxygen for 12 to 24 hours.
Okay,
After
sir.
that you can give 80% for another 36 hours, then 60% or another 48 hours, then 50% eternally. You can give 50% safely for any number of hours. But from 100, 80, 60, you have to rapidly decrease it and bring it to 50 as early as possible to avoid this major problem of oxygen toxicity. So giving 100% oxygen or 80% oxygen for very long duration should be avoided. And as early as possible, it should be brought to 50%, which is the safest limit to prevent oxygen toxicity whenever a patient is hypoxic. If you add that
Okay, sir.
point alone, that will be okay.
Okay, sir.
Okay, that's a good preparation. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Right.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Priyanka. And now, any doubts from the participants, students?
Any questions?
All participants are unmuted. You can unmute yourself and ask your doubts. I don't see any questions in the chat box.
Yeah. So everybody is hungry. So
Yes,
you
sir.
want to have dinner. Okay. Thank
If
you.
no questions, sir, I seek your permission to sign off this today's session.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you, madam. And thank you, dear participants. We'll meet next week, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Good night, sir.